Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Hello and welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. In today's episode, we're continuing our discussion on the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Act 2026 and looking at part 2 of the Act, which contains changes that may become some of the biggest shifts in education policy in England for many years. So while some headlines around the legislation have focused on breakfast clubs, mobile phones and academies, the wider significance of Part 2 is much broader than that. The legislation increasingly signals a move towards stronger national oversight, greater local authority coordination, and more integrated safeguarding responsibilities, together with a more regulated education system overall. And joining me again is Sara. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Sam. Yeah, I think what's really important about part 2 is that it's not simply introducing isolated education reforms. It's setting the direction for what the government increasingly believes schools should be within wider society. And the message running through the legislation is that schools are not viewed simply as places of academic instruction anymore. Increasingly, they are being framed as key safeguarding, wellbeing and public service institutions.
And we can see that through some of the welfare-focused reforms within the Act, can't we?
Absolutely. The legislation introduces universal breakfast club duties for primary schools, expands free school meal eligibility and strengthens allergy safety responsibilities. What's important is that these are increasingly being treated not simply as operational matters, but as part of a wider safeguarding and wellbeing framework.
And the changes are really topically focused, aren't they? For example, the allergy provisions are particularly significant, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And listeners may like to access our previous podcast where we looked at this topic in detail, because historically, much allergy management has often relied heavily on guidance from local policy.
I also think what this legislation increasingly does is create a stronger legal framework around allergy management, anaphylaxis preparedness, staff training and policy publication. And importantly, the Act creates powers for future regulations as well, which suggests schools may see much more detailed national expectations around allergy safety in the years ahead. The mobile phone provisions, they've also received a lot of public attention, haven't they?
Yeah, and we've identified it in our podcast, Mobile Phone Free Schools. The legislation itself is actually more nuanced than many headlines suggest. The Act is less about introducing an outright national ban and more about establishing a framework for future expectations around device use, online safety, distraction, behaviour and wellbeing in schools.
Probably one of the most significant areas in Part 2 is the entirely new framework around children not in school and elective home education.
And I would say that arguably one of the biggest safeguarding reforms within the whole Act, actually.
Yeah,
At its core, the legislation is driven by a very clear safeguarding principle that children should not become effectively invisible to education and safeguarding systems simply because they're educated outside that mainstream school settings.
And this introduces major new powers and duties for local authorities. The Act creates mandatory local authority registers for children not in school. It strengthens parental information duties. It introduces powers to obtain information from tutors and out-of-school providers, expands information sharing powers, and strengthens school attendance order arrangements. And what's particularly important is that these reforms go far beyond education alone. Much of the framework is clearly rooted in safeguarding concerns around children who may be vulnerable, isolated, missing education, or outside professional oversight. And the legislation also changes the balance between parental choice and state oversight.
Yes, very significantly, actually. Home education remains lawful, but the Act clearly increases the ability of local authorities to monitor educational arrangements, assess suitability, and intervene where concerns exist. This is especially clear in the new provisions requiring local authority consent before some vulnerable children can be withdrawn from school for home education, particularly where there are safeguarding concerns, SEND vulnerability, or previous child protection involvement.
And again, information sharing becomes a major theme here, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Part two repeatedly strengthens powers for schools, local authorities, safeguarding agencies, and government bodies to share information where it supports education welfare or safeguarding functions. The legislation reflects growing concern nationally that children can become vulnerable where agencies hold disconnected pieces of information, and no single organisation has that full safeguarding picture.
And much like part one of the Act, this feels like legislation is, that's laying foundations for future systems, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Children Not in School framework increasingly looks like the beginning of a much more integrated national visibility and oversight system through registration systems, information sharing duties, national guidance, and enforcement powers. The legislation, it's creating infrastructure for much more coordinated safeguarding oversight in the future. Another major theme running through part two is the changing direction of the academy system.
Yeah, and this is probably one of the most politically significant parts of the legislation. Over the
Yeah.
last decade, academies have often operated with greater autonomy around curriculum, staffing, teacher qualifications, admissions, and local authority involvement. Now, part two begins to narrow many of those differences.
It does. And it also introduces stronger regulation and oversight powers, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. The Act creates powers relating to teacher qualifications and induction in academies, greater alignment around pay and conditions, direct application of the national curriculum. That's going to go down like a lead balloon with some people who've gone academy, stronger government intervention power, and direct inspection of academy trusts by Ofsted. So the trusts will get inspected, not just necessarily the schools.
And that trust level inspection element is, it's particularly significant,
Oh,
isn't it?
very significant. Because historically, accountability has focused mainly on individual schools. What this legislation increasingly does, it creates formal accountability around trust-wide leadership, governance, safeguarding, well-being, and school improvement. And again, the Act is not simply making immediate operational changes, it's creating enabling powers and legal frameworks for future national regulation and oversight.
And the legislation also signals a move away from automatic academisation as the default solution for school improvement.
Yep.
One of the symbolic reforms within the Act is the removal of the automatic duty to issue academy orders for schools causing concern. Now, this doesn't end academisation, but it clearly shifts away from the previous assumption that academy conversion should always be the default response to school failure. And local authorities also gain stronger coordination powers.
Absolutely. The legislation strengthens duties requiring schools, academies, and local authorities to cooperate around admissions, attendance, inclusion, school places, and vulnerable pupils. Local authorities also, they gain stronger powers to direct academies to admit vulnerable or hard to place pupils. And the wider message throughout the legislation is increasingly clear. Publicly funded schools are expected to operate not simply as individual institutions, but as part of a wider local education and safeguarding system.
When we step back and look at the overall picture, part two feels like a major rebalancing of the English education system, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's it. Right. The legislation doesn't remove academies or school autonomy entirely, but it clearly shifts the system towards greater national consistency stronger safeguarding oversight, increased local coordination, and a sort of clearer collective responsibilities across education. And perhaps most importantly, the Act increasingly connects education policy with safeguarding attendance, well-being, inclusion, and public accountability in ways we probably haven't seen before at this scale.
So, to reflect, what part 2 of the Act increasingly makes clear is that education policy and safeguarding policy are becoming far more closely connected. But perhaps most significantly, this legislation is not only introducing immediate reforms, it's creating the legal powers, duties, and regulatory frameworks that enable future changes to the education system. Across areas such as safeguarding oversight, attendance home education, academy accountability, information sharing, and local authority coordination, the Act is laying the legislative foundations for a more integrated, regulated, and centrally coordinated system in the years ahead. The direction of travel is towards greater oversight, stronger multi-agency working, and a model where schools are increasingly viewed not simply, as you said, Sarah, as standalone institutions, but as integrated parts of wider local safeguarding and children's service systems. So for school leaders, safeguarding professionals and education providers, these reforms will shape future policy, accountability and practice. Thanks for listening to this episode of Safeguarding Conversations. I do hope you'll join us for the final podcast on the Act, which focuses on Part 3, online safety and general provisions. Take care.